so many people who feel like they've outgrown their friends, or so many people who feel like they're growing in different directions, or wonder if they have anything in common, or feel stuck in a role, or feel stuck at a certain level of the relationship and feel like they've gone to a different level. And so our context is going to be kind of religious, but I think it can be broader than any of that. But yeah, what are you feeling as we think about having this conversation about potentially outgrowing each other?
I think it's an important conversation to have because there are really good friendships out there that people let go of because they feel that they've outgrown them. When the truth is, it just takes a conversation and some intentionality, and then you don't have to lose someone who's so special or who you've racked up the consistency with. And so I think that we did that really well because we could have walked away with no hurt feelings and just been like, it just wasn't feeding me anymore. Obviously,
or a lot of hurt feelings,
meaning that like it wasn't like one incident, it wasn't, it just luckily we did have the girls group to force a little bit of consistency.
Yes.
And so we had some boundaries that were set in place previously by ourselves and other people to keep us in it. But yeah, there were definitely some moments of panic on my part.
Yeah, no, I think for both of us, and this is a fascinating subject to kind of go back to and think about. I'm eager to hear what it felt like to be you and to kind of look back on this. So I think it's really important to name that our relationship started in a religious context. I was a pastor at a Seventh-day Adventist church, and you attended, and then we became in a small group, a women's group, and our women's group gathered for the purpose of kind of continued study and reading books, and it was a spiritual, religious, church-based group. And so I think that's important to name because this is the area then, so this is what brings us together initially, and this is also the area that we end up taking vastly different journeys on. And so yeah, I mean, so it's not just kind of like a different area of life. It's not like we just met in one place and like this became a different thing. This is the context that kind of bonded us to each other. And that's the area that we ended up kind of changing on. So we both ended up moving away from there and going on very, very different journeys. So I moved up here. I moved up to Northern California, and my husband and I started a spiritual community. So I was now not Seventh-day Adventist, but it was still a gathering. It was a weekly spiritual community, and we were trying to make it inclusive and non-affiliated with any denomination, just trying to make it a safe place for people to talk about their faith and kind of deconstruct and have big ideas and express doubts and ask questions. And so we had this like spiritual community. So that's kind of already a step out from kind of the way you and I met each other. And then through that place, I'm kind of deconstructing my faith, and I'm asking really big questions, and I'm saying, I don't agree with this anymore, and I don't believe this, but I actually think this. And I'm reading things I hadn't read and being exposed to things I hadn't been exposed to, and going on a very different journey in a different direction. Where did you go? How would you describe your spiritual journey or your religious journey after our small group ended?
Well, as you were describing it just now, like I was thinking to myself, yeah, it was a little bit of a bait and switch for me. Like I came into your small group, yearning to learn more, and you stepped up to the plate, and right off the bat, you became my authority of all things religious, and that is kind of like wording, if you will. I mentioned on the other podcast, I'm a 6 on the Enneagram. So I look for authority, and I tend to look for it outside. And then I can do either two things because I am counterphobic, that I can either like dig in deep into that, or I can be a counterphobic and then just rebel against it. And so I do that dance where certain things I dig in deep and I will follow you to the end, or I'm just going to rebel against you. And so you became my authority figure on everything Adventism. In my mind, though, it was everything God and spiritual and whatever. But I realize now it was a little bit of that, but it was mainly like Adventism. And remember, like I'm a 5th generation Adventist and 5th generation vegetarian, and I went to all Adventist schooling through my first master's, and like, so I know stuff. But
you know lots of stuff.
I know lots of stuff, but I didn't trust myself. Mm-hmm. So you were my authority figure. I could come to you because you weren't touting the line on everything. You were giving it to me in a real way, in a way that was alive, in a way of a metaphor. And when you started deconstructing, because we were not together, I did not know you were doing that. So we would get together and I would still be asking you questions, and you were now incorporating more things than just Adventism in your answers, but I did not know that. And so I remember one time you said, well, Marianne Williamson says this, and that quote has like stuck with me. And so years later, when I started reading her, like I reached out to you and I said, where should I start with Marianne Williamson? But I don't know why, but I was in an airport. I don't remember where I was going. And I saw one of her books, as you know how the airports are always, giving you recommendations on what to read. And I remember texting you going, is Marianne Williamson a Christian author? and you had a very nice answer to that in a very clever way. And and then years later, when I was ready to read her, I realized, now looking back, you were able to answer my questions in your integrity. And they were landing with me, but I didn't realize that they weren't like...
You didn't know what source they were coming from. Yeah, so to give a little bit of context, we were both raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and it's a conservative Christian religion that some people might know from like the Blue Zones and like Loma Linda University and that kind of a thing. But it meets on Saturdays as the Sabbath, kind of like the Jewish Friday night to Saturday night thing, which is very different from all the other Sunday denominations. So there creates this, and that, we don't need to get in the weeds on the religious thing of it, but it does create this very like separate religion where we grew up going to only schools with Adventists and like didn't attend like big sporting events and stuff like that on Saturdays, and like all the things, like we have our own world for everything, our own schools, our own hospitals. Like, so it's a very close knit community. Like, all the leaders, so it's a world that is a very big, deep world that can like at best feel like a community and like everybody knows everybody, and at worst can feel kind of incestuous and like, that kind of a bubble. But I think it's important to name all that because this is a big deal. This is like, so for us, like stepping out of this is a big deal, or kind of like trying to figure out if we're out or in and that kind of a stuff. So I kind of started moving out of that bubble. And to that point, there's only certain authors that would be credible in that bubble, right? And there's only so it's like just only Seventh-day Adventist people would be like kind of in that bubble primarily. And so I'm reading authors and practices and experiences that are outside of that bubble, which is threatening and scary in the bubble. And you moved to Texas and went deep. I would say, from my perspective, I should let you name your own journey. From my perspective, it felt like you were going deeper in the bubble. Is that what it felt like to be you?
100%. I had always said when I moved to Texas, I became a better Adventist. And I was very proud of that. I was very proud of becoming a better Adventist. And I remember I said that to a friend of mine who is a pastor's wife, and she was not happy with that. She goes, I hate it when people say that because Adventism is Christianity. And I remember being kind of taken aback because I'm like, this is my experience. I'm allowed to name my experience. And I became a better Adventist. I became a better rules follower. I did become deeper in my walk, but it was a walk that was outside of what I now see as the metaphor that life can be. It was a very literal walk. And in order to make sure that I was knowing what was going on and what was expected of me and wanting to live up to expectations. Like, I remember I sat down and I finally read through the Bible like front to back for the first time, and I did it 3 times in a row.
I remember. And
then the third time I did it, I sat down and I read the Bible alongside of, it's called the Conflict of the Ages series, and it's written by our modern day prophet, if you will, Ellen G. White. And I wanted to know what I was conflating. I wanted to know what was actually in the Bible and what was actually in what we call the spirit of prophecy. And I wanted to know. And it was a very enriching experience. I learned a lot. I don't think I would say I had a mountaintop experience or whatever, but I would say I learned a lot, and it became integral in my deconstruction. I did not realize how integral it would be, but for my temperament with my 5 wing on the Enneagram, where I need to go to through these deep dives, I had to have a foundation to know exactly what needed to be deconstructed. So it's kind of funny what I was doing in an effort to fortify my identity, my religion, who I was, knowing what was expected of me, because like, I was board chair of the school, and I was women's ministries director, and I was leading Cradle Roll Sabbath School, and like, I was doing all these things, and I just felt that I needed to make sure that I was doing it right.
Yeah. And it's so fascinating to watch both of us, because then I'm starting to do practices and read books that like people in the bubble would say is like of the devil, and so like I'm starting to kind of like go down a very different path, and I'm watching you. Like, one of the things I respect about you so much, Jaylene, is there's a lot of people who just stay, and you could have just stayed and I could have left, and we would have had these two parallel journeys that we should have a conversation about too. But you, to your point, you're like, if I'm going to stay, I'm going to stay. And you're like, I'm not going to do anything half-assed, right? Like, I'm all in, and I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow, I'm going to take this seriously. And I have so much respect for that. So you and I both just are in very different places. So let's talk now less about the religion part and more about like how it felt to be each of us, and how, when we started having an awareness. So as you kind of like were sharing that it took you a little while to realize I was deconstructing as much as, and which part of that, I'm like, I think part of that is a good thing. That part of that is like, I'm not pushing it on you. I'm not trying to pull you out. I'm not trying to talk you out of things. Like I'm supporting and respecting. But part of that, the downside of that is like, was I stepping in, like I was hiding a little bit, or I wasn't like, maybe I wasn't being able to share everything with you, or having a little bit of an imposter experience, So I mean, like there's that interesting line between how much to share with somebody that you might not want to like burst their bubble, so to speak, or I might not want to disappoint you, or I might not want to be judged by you, or I might like all that stuff that's interesting in there. But then there's also something where it's kind of beautiful that we were able to still be friends and not necessarily name all that.